Now, there we come to our next speaker and our next presentation. Emily Austin will join us here on stage. She's a principal researcher at Census. For people who don't know Census, I'm sure you'll get to know them, but I know them as one of the companies with the most amount of certificates ever collected. She studies security threats and other interesting internet phenomena, and she'll discuss a couple of these today. And actually, she tries to applicate or use data science and analytic techniques to actually solve some problems in security, which is definitely something that we need to do with the huge bunch of data stacks that we have available to us. Emily, welcome to stage. I'm very interested in your presentation that you're going to give here on our Chinese state actor Salt Typhoon, which we don't know much about. Not much has been published, only that they apparently targeted telecommunication companies in the US. But it seems that you've uncovered something. I give the floor to you. Thank you very much. Welcome. Go ahead.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. I appreciate it. Everyone, I'm excited to be here. And today I want to talk to you, about Salt Typhoon, specifically exposures of devices that we think are potentially targeted by Salt Typhoon. So we'll get into it. So today I want to start, here's kind of a roadmap of what I want to talk about. We'll start with a little bit of background and context on Salt Typhoon, just to kind of get a good timeline of events there. And then we'll move to talking about vulnerabilities that are potentially in some way linked to Salt Typhoon. Specifically, we'll talk about 4 different devices, 6 different CVEs across them, and we'll look at exposure numbers across a 6-month time frame, as well as some geographic footprint information. And then we'll tie it all together. Once we've been in the weeds, we'll kind of come back out and go, okay, well, what does this all mean? Where do we go from here? And what can we learn from these exposures? But to start, I think it would be useful to talk a little bit about Salt Typhoon as an actor. I imagine most folks on this call are familiar with them, at least nominally. But just as a refresher and sort of a reminder of who they are and sort of what they're known for, I'm going to talk a little bit about their history. So Salt Typhoon kind of emerged publicly in September of 2024. This is when news broke regarding a hack on multiple US-based ISPs. And interestingly, kind of in contrast to another typhoon, Volt Typhoon, Volt Typhoon was really largely focused on, we think, gaining access to critical infrastructure networks. So they were targeting those networks, trying to get in to maybe pre-position to later carry out attacks, say maybe if there were ever kinetic activity in Taiwan, hypothetically speaking. But Salt Typhoon, in contrast, even early on, was thought to be more geared toward espionage. And it turns out that's correct, or at least appears to be correct, based on subsequent information and things we learned. So you can see here a series of stories from fall of 2024 where they targeted US wiretapping systems among major telecommunications providers. They also exfiltrated cellular records on Americans and eavesdropped on conversations of folks who were involved in government or political activity. So very much sort of an espionage angle to what they're doing. And it just kind of kept getting worse throughout the end of the year last year. We just kind of closed out 2024 going, well, this was pretty terrible, actually. And we think they're still in there. We're not really sure how to completely flush them out. They're still in these networks, right? So not really a great positive end to 2024 on that note. But there's more. We continued rolling right into 2025 with more news of Salt Typhoon going after telecommunications companies. And just last month, the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity published a threat bulletin that detailed activity they attribute to Salt Typhoon from February of this year, where Salt Typhoon leveraged a particular CVE in a product we'll talk about today to gain access to their network. So they're still very active. There's still a lot of this activity arguably happening. even though public reports are kind of minimal at best. And on that note, before we really get into talking about the data, I think I have to address this sort of one of the complications of tracking Salt Typhoon and investigating Salt Typhoon, particularly frustrating as a researcher. For any other folks who are following them or have tried, I imagine you must also feel this frustration. Publicly available IOCs and TTPs that are sort of TLP clear and first party are really difficult to come by with Salt Typhoon. Vendors have different ways of tracking and attributing activity to this actor. It's all very fuzzy in a lot of ways. And this is a screenshot of a blog post that I think is just really great at explaining sort of the intricacies of tracking and investigating Salt Typhoon, which could be a talk on its own. This is a great post by Joe Slowick. And I would highly recommend, if you're interested in that and learning more about like kind of why tracking this group is so hard, this is a great read and would highly recommend it. So with those caveats out of the way, here's a quick look at the 4 devices we're going to talk about today. I won't dwell here, but just one thing I'll call out is lots of web interfaces. Web interfaces that shouldn't be exposed to the public internet is what we'll be talking about. So let's start with Sophos and talk about this remote code execution vulnerability in the Sophos firewall. So as of April 2025, we see just under 133,000 of these exposed on the internet. This is from a 6-month time frame looking at October 2024 through April of 2025. This is a drop of about 35% of these devices from what we saw initially in October, which was around 205,000. So this is kind of a spoiler in that we're starting with the good news. We're starting with the device that actually saw some meaningful reduction in exposure over this time frame. It kind of goes downhill from here, unfortunately. But so this is sort of the positive story, I think, of the bunch. Like we've seen this sort of trend downward over time. Looking geographically, this is really the only exposure we're going to talk about today where the US is not in the lead. This is, like I said, the only service. We've also seen a significant exposure reduction throughout the study timeframe. But we see the highest concentration of these actually in Germany, more than anywhere else in the world. We do see them kind of spread globally beyond that, but Germany really wins here with the footprint of Sophos firewalls. Next, I want to talk about 2 vulnerabilities in Cisco IOS XE WebUI. So it's a privilege escalation vulnerability, a command injection vulnerability. So these 2 vulnerabilities kind of tied together are interesting. And the one that's a 10.0 is this privilege escalation vulnerability, 2023-20198. This is actually the same vulnerability mentioned in that Canadian Center for Cybersecurity Bulletin that was exploited earlier this year. So, a CVE from 2023, it's pretty nasty. It's still being exploited as of early 2025 at the least. And when you combine it with this command injection vulnerability, you essentially get full control over these devices. So again, really not ideal. This privilege escalation vulnerability is, I would say, one of the nastier ones we've seen probably in kind of edge devices. We never like to see things like this in things that are exposed directly to the internet, and this is a prime example of exactly why. When we look at geographic footprint of these different devices, again, we see that the US really hosts the most exposed devices as of April of this year, with just under 8,000 instances. And kind of interestingly, in contrast to some of the other devices that we've talked about and will talk about, most of these exposures are actually concentrated in the Americas. So with 5 countries, so the US, Mexico, Peru, Brazil, and Chile accounting for over half, about 60% of the top exposures worldwide, right? And again, I just kind of want to call it the geography here. Like, I think that's a very interesting kind of piece we can look at is sort of how these devices show up differently regionally, and sort of some of the different regional footprints we see across the world. I also want to talk about Ivanti Connect Secure, authentication bypass, and command injection, also kind of another nasty set of vulnerabilities. So CVE 2023 46805, this is this auth bypass, which is an 8.2 CVSS score. And then we have a command injection vulnerability of a 9.1. So essentially, you put these together and their powers combined, you get unauthenticated remote code execution. Any kind of remote code execution, again, on edge devices, things that touch the internet, this is all really not ideal. You don't want these in these devices sitting on the public internet without any kind of protection around them, right? Like these are just not ideal. So as of April 2025, looking at our kind of 6-month exposure trends, we saw just under 23,000 of these in April that might be vulnerable to this authentication bypass vulnerability. And that's a bit of a drop from 26,000 that we saw in October of 2024. So we're seeing a little bit of a decrease, right, net over time. But again, not tremendous, not significant like we saw kind of early on with that first product that we looked at. I think there's probably going to be questions about this spike that we see in the graph that lines up in mid-December. So mid-December, we see this jump in Ivanti devices online. And this actually coincides with the timing of an Ivanti security bulletin talking about 6 additional vulnerabilities in their Connect Secure and Policy Secure products. And one of the theories, we don't know for sure, but one of our hypotheses about this spike is that this actually might be folks spinning up honeypots for these devices in response to this advisory. This is something we've explored. We actually have some blog posts on this as well, going back into the last year or so, where when there's a security advisory from a company, particularly one that deals with edge devices or things that are publicly on the internet, we'll tend to see sometimes a little bit of an increase, or if there's a really big, interesting CVE that gets released or added to CIS's known exploited vulnerabilities list, we'll see kind of an uptick in these devices, at least what looks like an uptick in them, as researchers are trying to collect telemetry about who's scanning for them, what's going on, what are we seeing? So everyone's wanting to collect information and data about these different devices. So that's one theory as to what's happening here. We're always trying to tease these out from like real actual devices, but sometimes the methods for setting up the honeypots can be quite good and quite stealthy. So just kind of an interesting anomaly and an interesting piece of the data, I think personally. It's also interesting to sort of track these rises over time and see sort of what's going on, and is there something maybe we can anticipate from that. So looking globally, again, the United States really wins out here, unfortunately. We have the highest concentration of exposures, more than double the next highest country with exposures, which is Japan. Although I will say, relative to some of the other devices we've talked about, there's just fewer of these online in general. We're talking in the thousands versus the tens or hundreds of thousands, which is good, but also, not ideal, right? Like we don't want to see so many of these exposed. And they are spread pretty broadly across Asia, Europe, North America. There's not really any particular like region where we see these very, very strongly. The final product I want to talk to you about today, and vulnerability that I want to talk to you about today, is this SQL injection in Fortinet Forticlient. So first, before even talking about like the exposure or anything like that, I just want to draw your attention to the fact and kind of emphasize again, this is a 9.8 severity SQL injection vulnerability that is from 2023. the things, like the number of things wrong with that statement in my brain are tremendous. It's wild to me that we're still seeing major SQL injection vulnerabilities in products that are enterprise products, right? Let alone this one has been out for a couple of years, but the fact that it was noted in 2023 is kind of wild to me, quite frankly. And it actually reminds me of a few years ago, Move It. The initial vulnerability with Move It that Klopp began exploiting was a SQL injection vulnerability. So not to detract from like the discussion of exposure and things like that, but this is really, really a low bar. I think, not to soapbox too much, but I do think it's really important that we demand a little better from enterprise products. In 2025, like SQL injection just feels really unacceptable to me. Um, it's absolutely wild. So anyway, that aside, looking at the exposure snapshots here, going from October to April of this year, um, we don't really see a ton of a drop here. We see about 2,800 of these exposed in April. Um, which is similar to what we saw in October, not very different. We do see a little bit of a dip around the first of the year, and I don't unfortunately have a great explanation for that. Some of this could just be configuration changes. Some of this could be things kind of in flux online. Not 100% sure there, but I will say just kind of looking at the trend over this time frame, that reduction doesn't really give me a lot of confidence because again, we're still kind of where we started, as unfortunate as that is. And SQL injection. We're still talking about SQL injection. Um, so as of April, we in the United States, we still see, excuse me, the highest concentration of these devices exposed. And again, it is a lot fewer than some of these other devices we've talked about. We're talking about thousands, not, or at least 1,000 in the US. We're not talking about hundreds of thousands, but again, still it's a SQL injection vulnerability and it's in thousands of these devices. So we're not really ideal. Um, excuse me. I'm so sorry. The SQL injection choked me up. What can I say? So we also see these instances, excuse me, across Europe and Asia and Africa as well, but really like the United States is where we see the majority of these. Um, so where do we go from here? What does this all mean and what can we do with this information? There's a couple of points that I want to kind of leave you with as we close out this session. First, we're talking about these vulnerabilities in the context of Salt Typhoon, a major threat actor, nation state threat actor, who's gone after some really large enterprise organizations, telecommunications companies, but we're still not seeing any major meaningful reduction in exposure of these devices. Again, Sophos firewall is really the only place we've seen that. These other devices aren't really moving in the right direction. It's just not quite happening, which is a little disheartening, right? Like these things are getting attention and we're just not seeing the drops we would hope to. Moreover, really from a research perspective and sort of a CTI perspective, it is really difficult to find TLP clear first party information about Salt Typhoon. There's like kind of leaks and bits here and there. I shouldn't say leaks. There's sort of like bits here and there. But it's really hard to verify. And as we were doing this research, we were going through and kind of bouncing from vendor report to vendor report to vendor report because we would see, reports citing other reports rather than their own telemetry. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Like we did our whole report based on what other telemetry is saying about these devices. But again, the lack of primary sources is just really, really difficult as a researcher, especially, I think a lot of us kind of have this trust but verify sort of sense of way of operating. And it's really hard. It's really hard to not be able to like put eyes on things ourselves and go, yes, we confirm that this is actually something this group has used. So that's hard. And I think if you take nothing else away from this session, aside from SQL injection just being really unfortunate, This is the thing I really think I would like for you to remember from this, which is we're talking about these vulnerabilities in these devices because of Salt Typhoon. But really, I could have come and given this presentation kind of irrespective of Salt Typhoon and said, hey, there are some major vulnerabilities and major exposures in these really prominent enterprise kind of edge products. And just because Salt Typhoon might not have targeted them, some other actor would, and some other actor probably is right now. Like it would sort of be silly not to. So even though we're talking about them in this context, I think the larger picture and the thing that I would really hope everyone walks away with is, things that don't need to be on the internet shouldn't be on the internet. Any kind of administrative interface, any kind of sort of back office software, there's absolutely no need for that to just sit out on the public internet with no VPN or firewall or any kind of privileged access. It's just unnecessary and opens you up to not only Salt Typhoon, but anyone else who wants to kind of hop on and sort of leverage these vulnerabilities, as they're seeing them come up in the news, right? So yeah, I would leave you with that. I think getting things off the internet is just a beautiful thing. Anything that doesn't need to be there, we shouldn't have it there. And so hopefully over time, we'll continue to see maybe better trends here. I'm not super hopeful, but I'm going to hold out hope for the Sophos firewall, at least, because it's trending in the right direction. But that's all I have. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I hope this was informative.
Thank you very much, Emily. Sorry, it was. I seem to have the same thing with the SQL injection. It's really troublesome. A great presentation. Thank you for that. And I think we can add one thing. The more devices are not on the internet that shouldn't be there, the more interesting devices we'll see in that clutter of data, right?
Absolutely.
All right, thank you very much. We won't have Q&A for now, but I'm sure that you'll be able to stay a little bit and answer a couple of the questions offline. And now we will go to the next presentation. Thanks a lot again, Emily, and see you next time.
Awesome. Thank you so much.